Hello everybody, and today I'm going to be discussing something that's been basically seared onto my prefrontal cortex, and that is something about Monster High that I don't think people really think about that often. Now that they are having a reboot, I just want to bring this up because I think it's rather interesting overall. So while I talk, I will allow my village to start, so that way we have something nice to look at while I ramble. No, that's not it. There we go. So, the thing about Monster High that not a lot of people bring up, and I think is an interesting allegory for disability, is just how the quote-unquote normies react to the monster's existence. So there is this tension where normies demonize and vilify the monsters, and the monsters really having to hide from the normies in general. And there's a lot of allegory that you can interpret as. I'm going to go with the disabled angle just because I'm disabled, though you can also read this as an angle of any sort of bigotry. And so I feel like that is very important to note, that I will not be discussing any sort of racial angle just because I'm not, I'm a white person, so this is not my area of expertise, but everything from here on out is going to be from the perspective of a person with a disability. And I'm just better with explaining in words, but I have left a comment on My World's YouTube channel, which is a much more abridged version of this. But in summary, the thing that really just cemented itself in my brain and why I fell in love with Monster High was Jackson Jekyll. Jackson Jekyll is this nerdy kid who gets bullied a lot at Monster High. It's established he came into Monster High when he was around 16, even though he'd been going to a human school for a very long time. And it is a very good allegory for being disabled and, like, finding out you have a disability and finding out that you might not belong in the standard school curriculum, and that there are a lot of things that make it really hard to adapt to this different culture, since there is a disability culture. It's the culture surrounding each and every individual is different. So there is a deaf community, a blind community, an autistic community, and the monsters themselves can be read as an allegory for the different disability communities that exist. There are different rules and regulations that govern how we behave around others. And so what might be appropriate in one group is not appropriate in another. So, for example, in the deaf community, it is considered to be completely socially acceptable to go up and tap someone on the shoulder, whereas for those with autism, that is not really a thing that works for everybody. For many people, being touched is something that only close family and friends can do, and even then, it might be off limits. Asking people, do you want to, for me to be able to touch you, is something that is very ingrained into autistic people. We are told, do not go up to someone and just hug them, ask first. And so, even just tapping someone on the shoulder is enough to say, look, you need to ask first and ask permission. And so the reason why I bring this up is because werewolves, vampires, even sea monsters have their own rules and culture that really govern it. But they're all under the same umbrella of being a monster. They're not part of normie culture. And a lot of the reason for their own culture is because of the discrimination they face against, from the humans. Monster High literally being the only safe place for a lot of these students to thrive as themselves. It is very interesting from the point of view of a disabled person to look in and say, okay, this really represents life as a disabled person. This does really emphasize how it can feel to be a person with a disability where you basically just look at all the ways life is. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to turn off this green thing because I want to see. Anyway, I'm sorry about that. I got distracted. You can't. Oh well. Anyway, the point here is that we see Jackson, and he goes into the, he is what I would consider to be passing. He passes as a normie. And even though Monster High never explicitly states the term passing, Jackson passes. Everybody mistakes him as being a human. Even monsters mistake him for being human. And as someone on the autism spectrum that passed really well, it is this kind of thing where you end up doing so even subconsciously. You pass as well as you can because there are, and when you're not in the disabled community, when you don't have a community, you have no other choice. If you don't pass, you don't make friends. You don't even get respect. The more you pass, the more respect you are given. Except there is this underlying feeling of not being good enough. You are never going to feel like you are disabled enough to really be able to use any of the advantages. And so when you are able to pass really well, you are stuck in between this really awkward moment where you're not disabled enough for the disabled community, or at least you don't feel like you're disabled enough, but at the same time, you're not able-bodied enough to be incorporated into the non-disabled world. And it makes it a lot harder, because when you're passing, you're putting on a mask, and it feels like what Jackson is doing. It feels like a Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing, where you are pretending to be someone else around different people. And there is a term, it's called code switching. Code switching being the ability to change how you communicate with certain people depending on who you're talking to. This is very prevalent in racial minorities, where they will use code switching to talk to another person because they'll talk to the dominant group, which mostly is white people, but this happens all around the world, but they'll use the predominant language of the majority, and then they'll code switch into the predominant language, but then they'll switch back to the language they're most comfortable with when they're around family and friends. And so Jackson is a very extreme version of this. He is very much a laid-back, quiet, respectful kid that is expected of him in the normie world, but he ends up turning into this crazy, music-loving, impulsive kid when he is around monsters, or he feels like he needs to fit in with the new group. And he doesn't know, and when he first starts out, he doesn't know how to code switch, because it can be interpreted that he's so used to passing as a human. He's so used to it that he cannot switch to being this authentic self. And am I reading way too much into this? Yes. I am reading way too much into this. This is probably not what the authors intended, but I don't care, because it is very interesting. The idea that his true self is being a monster, but he passed for so long, and he was almost shoeboxed into this passing ideology that he can't stick to himself. His true self is so impulsive because it never had a chance to thrive and shine. So you end up with this person that acts impulsively when given the freedom, because that is what they expect to do. Jackson expects that he's supposed to be wild, he's supposed to be crazy, and he's embodying so much of the stereotype that monsters are, that he's not even acting like a real monster, he's acting like a caricature of what he thinks a monster is. And so that's why we see him being this kind of jerkish, impulsive guy. Because that's not what, that's what he thinks he's supposed to be. And that's what his alter ego thinks he needs to be. And it shows how sometimes behavior is not even related to how a person really is, it's just what they think they ought to be. And how stereotypes can really pigeonhole people into behaving the way they think their peers want them to behave. And it feels more obvious because Jackson is viewed as annoying and obnoxious to a lot, obnoxious to a lot of other characters. Frankie doesn't seem to be a very big fan of Holt, and she likes Jackson for being a calm, sweet guy. There are a lot of things that are really interesting overall, and if you read into it, you can find a lot of interesting parallels between the real world and Monster High. Now, again, I don't think that the author really went into this, how do we philosophically depict the way that a person who's disabled who passes as non-disabled would view the world, because this is a really complicated thing that not a lot of people even know about or even talk about, but the fact that this can accidentally be read into is very fascinating, and why I fell in love with Monster High, because there are a lot of interesting situational things in the webisodes, in the diaries, that really add a lot of interesting flavor and context into it. Now, this isn't to say that it isn't that Monster High is free from problems. I can go on and on about some of the things that would be slightly more problematic, but given what we are given, and it being a major corporation thing that came out in 2010, it's really good. Like, super good. The last time I saw something that had such a deep, where you could really dive in deep and see something that really depicted allegory and complicated subjects like this, was in Avatar: The Last Airbender. So, it's been a while. Not 2010, 2012, actually. Yeah, it happened 10 years ago, but still. And I think that's reason why a lot of people still gravitate toward Monster High and are really glad that it is coming back, because it isn't just a doll line, it's what the doll line represents. We haven't seen I know, like, for years, there hasn't been that much representation of really anything. In fact, even, they even released Gil, a doll that came with a wheelchair. And so having and it was never really a big deal. It was never, oh, Gil's in a wheelchair, let's make an episode on why Gil is in a wheelchair. It's like, oh, Gil's in a wheelchair, cool. Unless I'm wrong. You guys can correct me in the comments if there was an episode or special where it was like, this is why Gil's in a wheelchair, and we're going to deal with him dealing with that, because it's mostly a thing. Gil is an interesting character too. He is, if I remember correctly, he doesn't speak, because he's a mermaid. He doesn't speak above water, so we don't hear him speak. There are several characters that are established to be either non-verbal or speak in a way that the audience can understand, but people who know them real well can understand them. And I feel like that is just really helps cement the idea that we're dealing with something that is very similar to a disabled allegory. And why it sticks with a lot of people who are really a big fan of it. It's just, there are so many reasons why someone would feel like an outcast, and Monster High can be read into by all those groups. You know, every group that has been discriminated against does do some form of code switching. Everybody has their own communities, and they understand that there is going to be a group of people that are going to feel like they have to pass in order to function in society because they are such a marginalized group. And I'll let them tell their story. So if someone wants to explain how it was, how if they're part of if they're a person of color, how Monster High feels to them, go ahead. I'm not going to touch that. That's not my area of expertise. I can only go off of being neurodivergent and what my experience is like growing up. So I can only base my experiences off of that. But I felt like there has to be some talk about how Jackson Jekyll was a really good representation of passing culture before I think anybody even really fully understood what passing was. Because around that time, I was only figuring it out, that I was passing as neurotypical. And I didn't have the words for it, but it was so wonderful to see that kind of representation where this person lives in a world where they're both normie and monster, but they don't know how to navigate the world because they pass too well. They pass too well as a normie. They can go around fine, but in order to pass, you have to fundamentally destroy the other side. You can't have both. You can't be a normie and a monster and not have psychological problems. There is always going to be this feeling of being torn between being disabled and not disabled. And it's really hard. Passing, as much as it sounds great, you know, like, oh, well, you can have best of both worlds, but it doesn't. It feels worse, in a way, to pass. I envy those who do not pass, because it's more obvious. As an adult, I'm more blatant about it, and I stopped really passing as non-disabled several years ago, and my life has gotten a lot better. Because passing is so taxing, it's doing so much, and keeping track of everything. I have to keep track of conversations, what people are doing, how they're how are they handling the conversation well? Are they liking the topic? And this is something that most people who are neurotypical automatically do. They automatically are interpreting what the other person is doing, where I have to do it manually. And so the only way I can express that is, like, imagine having to mentally keep track of where all your limbs are and whether you're breathing or not. Like, it's not as automatic as you think it is. And for me, it's not automatic. Seeing all this stuff is not automatic, but at the same time, I have no choice but to really do this unless I want to just be the loner who has no friends and doesn't have anybody who wants to deal with me. And so it's a lot more difficult. And so I see Jackson and I see a lot of me in him. So Monster High does do a lot of good representation in ways you might not even know. You might not think, oh, this is a good representation of someone who is dealing with this kind of battle. And yet it does touch on some pretty heavy subjects. In a very tasteful way, too. Nowhere does it explicitly, nowhere did the character stop and say, you know, I just feel like I'm passing too well. It's more narratively saying, Jackson is too human to really be accepted into the monster world. And it's only the It's subtext. The subtext says this, not the overarching text. We don't need exposition saying, this is Jackson, this is why he is being bullied. It is subtext, but mostly, it's not that sub. It's not like you have to really dig for it, but it's still something that if you know what to look for, you will find it. And that's what just makes Monster High so brilliant. There is a lot of interesting allegories and context that you cannot really fully grasp until you're older and you understand the culture that it's referencing. And that, for me, really took me a while to realize why Jackson, of all people, was ingrained into my skull. Like, it's just that one moment that just ingrains into my brain. And I don't remember if he actually said it or not. It might have been in his diary. I don't remember. I can't find the clip. Part of it just, like... an example would be when I guess I just watched this clip, but Jackson gets... Holtz gets arrested by the normie police, and then all of a sudden, when he code switches back to being normal and a normie, the cops just let him go. They just say, "Oh, you're normal. You're not a delinquent. So we're just gonna let you go, and we'll take you back to school." This guy has to insult himself in order to get let go from the police station, and so it's kind of like this, like you have to hate yourself in order to be accepted by society. You have to, in order to be fully accepted, and for people to basically give you a pass, you have to behave exactly how they want you to behave. You have to be exactly who they want you to be. And if you show any inkling that you're going to really like what you normally do like, you're going to be almost shunned for it. And so I think that is a very interesting concept overall, and an interesting message to send. That it's like, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. We don't talk about that kind of discrimination. We normally talk about, well, this person obviously hates this other person, but it doesn't talk about the complex nature and the intersectionality of being both disabled but not being able to pass. And the way that we can interpret our own how we view ourselves because of the way other people have talked about us. And so, well, yes, this is a very long video about a literal show for children. Like, the show, the webisodes, the dolls, they weren't destined for me. They were not made for me. I was, in 2012, I was almost 20. I was, 18 years old when it came out. But I remember being interested in it because I read the wiki. I didn't read the books. I'm guilty, but I read the wiki, and it was so interesting to see how the monsters were forced to pass in the books. They were forced to pretend to be human in order to not face discrimination. And that's what really got me hooked, was I related so much to that concept. Now, I should read the books. Even though I haven't. But it is a very interesting concept overall, and I would say that Monster High definitely has earned its place in being remembered. Why Claudine has never been confirmed as gay, because is bafflingly stupid to me. I know that the original creators, like, we wanted to make her LGBT, but we weren't allowed to. And, excuse me, I am all for Claudine being LGBT. I am a Claudine stan. I will love Claudine to the ends of the earth. She is one of the characters that I love the most. I can't help it. Her and Laguna. Her and Laguna are like two of my favorite Monster High characters that are like part of the main four. The other character I really love is Nephra, but for other reasons. Nephra, complicated. Anyway, the point is, love Claudine. And I love how they I just love how they've really brought on these complicated subjects that really nobody can really think about enough. Like, I can possibly go on for like another 3 hours on this, but I'm not, because frankly, I just don't feel like it would be my place to keep on going. And I want to allow the floor to be for those groups of people. But this is just my opinion. This is my take on it. If you say, oh, you're thinking way too much into this, the answer is yes. Yes, I am. I am looking way too deep into this. There's no chance that this was intentional, but at the same time, I do not believe that the author's intent always matters. The way things are perceived outside of the author's intent, once the media leaves the author, it no longer matters too much on what the author intended. Unless you're saying unless you're talking about the true interpretation, that's one thing. But you can always have a fan interpretation that is pretty much equally as valid as other things. It's just you can't claim it's canon. And I stand by this because just because you intend for something to be read one way doesn't mean that it's going to be read. There's always that narrative dissonance that you take the risk with. Will someone interpret the thing differently because of their own life experiences? And it's always a challenging thing to balance. And I think that Monster High did a really good job at this kind of allegory. Even if it's not intentional, it's still an amazing thing. This is one of the times where it's the accidental thing is still probably better than what was intentioned. So, that's just my opinion. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good night. Have a good day. Wherever you are, just have a good one. Thanks for watching, and bye.